Welcome to Moss Man on the Masters of the Universe Classic Director's Commentary with me, Scott, ToyGuru Neitlich. I was the brand manager for a good chunk, well, like 90% plus of the MOTUC Classics line from Mattel. And I did screw up in the last video, and I forgot to put the little coming next time bug at the end, which was the MOTU versus DCU 2-packs video. So I threw the bug at the top of this video, so that way anyone who's binging all the videos can just, kind of watch them straight through. Or for those of you who are like, why in the world is there the ending bug at the beginning? That's why. All right, enough of that. Let's talk about Moss Man. And Moss Man is one of those figures you kind of have to talk about in light of both Beast Man and maybe Swamp Thing. Well, those type of characters, because Moss Man's a lot more than just the MOTU version of Swamp Thing. He's not Swamp Thing, but he tends to get compared to him a lot. A lot of fans, and myself included, really look at Moss Man as kind of part of the second or sometimes third wave of MOTU characters introduced in the 80s. I included characters like Buzz-Off and Cyclone. He was around for a good chunk of the vintage line, and he's one of those characters that has kind of broken out and sort of become part of pop culture into himself, just because he was kind of the first flocked action figure, and he was scented, and he kind of had this green Bigfoot vibe going for him, I guess you could say. There was a lot going on with Moss Man, and when it came time to putting him in classics, we really wanted to look at all the different versions of him over the years, including things like the vintage artwork and his appearance in the animation, how he was in both Filmation and in the 2000X series, because he tended to have kind of this friendly woodsman-y look whenever he was in the animation, as kind of like a friend to nature, but the action figure was kind of, I guess if you will, like very angry and fierce because he had this screaming look, which of course the reason he had that screaming look is because he was just a flocked version of Beast Man, all the way down to Beast Man's head in the vintage line. Moss Man and Beast Man had the, fans probably know this, but if you didn't, hey, spoiler alert, they had the exact same head. That's why Moss Man has that kind of angry, screaming head instead of sort of a calm, peaceful nature guardian head, which is how he's portrayed in a lot of the media and a lot of the artwork. But the flocking and the green plastic tended to kind of hide that fact. So even if you had Beast Man and Moss Man when you were a kid, actually I didn't have Beast Man, but my best friend Sean did, so I did have time to sort of play with both of them. I had no idea until I was an adult or maybe a teenager, that they were the same, basically mold or sculpt, re-decoed, re-flocked, I guess you could say. Obviously as an adult, you can see it clearly, but as a kid, I never noticed it. I just thought Moss Man had a cool screaming head. And of course, this was something that the 2000X line took advantage of when they needed to get a promo figure out there and they didn't have a tooling budget. It was easy to take the 2000X Beast Man and then just flock him and call him Moss Man. So this definitely looked a lot more like Beast Man, I think, than Moss Man, especially because Moss Man in the show was very much redesigned. And flocking Beast Man in 2000X was more of just kind of like I wouldn't call it a joke or like an inside joke, but it was more like an homage to the vintage line. And when it came to classics, obviously we did want to have this same homage and, include Beast Man's head, but Moss Man was absolutely a candidate to get a second head. And a lot of this came from how he was designed for the 2000X show. He never had an action figure in 2000X, but the Horsemen actually did fully sculpt a Moss Man action figure for this line. It was just never released. I'm sorry I don't have an image of it, but I think if you can use your imagination, and based on what he looked like in the show, you can kind of figure out what he looked like. The image might be floating around on the internet somewhere. If I can find an image, I'll put a link in the description. But point being is the version you saw in the animated show was based on the Horseman design. So the Horseman designed Moss Man first and then put him in the show, as opposed to the reverse happening where he gets designed first for the show and then they have to make an action figure based on that. So we definitely in Classics wanted to both pay homage to the vintage figure, but also incorporate a lot of what the Horseman had wanted to do with the 2000X figure that was never released, which included the bandolier and the removable knife and the original having the weapon be sort of more wood-like. We also really wanted to include the shield that they had intended for the 2000X figure, and for some reason, I think it was cost, we couldn't include that, but we did get it with the minifigure there. So one of the big things with Moss Man is obviously the fact that he was a scented action figure. And while we were steering away from action features that would have included engineering, meaning like pegs sticking out the back or, mechanisms that had to do something, having a figure have a scent was just as easy pretty much as having a figure be glow in the dark. It was really just a type of plastic. So much as we could give Scareglow his glow-in-the-dark action feature, it was pretty easy to give Moss Man his vintage scented feature, which basically meant mixing up scented plastic beads like these here and mixing them with regular plastic. So what the vendor does in China is they just basically take the green plastic for Moss Man and they add in scented plastic chips, in this case pine scented, and they mix them together when the plastic is liquefied, and then it just gets poured into the mold. And that's basically how you get a scented action figure. Same thing with Stingor, but we'll get to that. Flocking. All right, the other big thing about Moss Man, he was a flocked action figure. So what is flocking, and how do you get it on an action figure? Well, a lot of people know flocking really from Christmas trees. When you see like kind of the white fake snow put on trees, that's actually flock. What flock is they're just basically tiny little hairs that you spray a surface with glue, with like a spray glue, and you either manually or with a machine add these little tiny hairs to it, and it gives the surface of whatever you want a kind of fuzzy feel. So flock comes in little baggies. I mean, you can buy flock at almost any art supply store like Michael's or Joann's or something like that. And you can add it to almost any craft project. It works, really best on flat surfaces, and that's actually going to be an issue, which we're going to get into, because unlike things like nails or carpets or pillows or Christmas trees, Moss Man was not a flat surface. And we were a little concerned about this when it came time to flocking. There's a flocked rug and shoe. Flocking works on lots of things. But on action features that have articulation, that was an issue. So the Horseman did not flock the prototype. This is their prototype that they made that basically was just Beastman's body in green, and there was no flocking applied because both them and us at Mattel weren't sure if it was going to work on an articulated figure. Essentially because the articulation would knock the flock off as the figure articulated. So we did tests. We did a whole bunch of tests. Partial flock, no flock, spot flocking, fully flocked. The original figure didn't have articulation in the arms, just, had 5 points and swiveled at the elbow, or at the shoulder. So it was much easier to flock. Same with Panther in the old line. He had no articulation. But now that we had articulation, we were very concerned about how this was going to work because we didn't want the flock to fall off in the long term. So we found a solution, essentially, by doing lots of tests. And there was a little bit of a backfire, and that was in terms of the flocked ears. A lot of fans will know there were actually 2 versions of Moss Man produced, one with furry ears and one with unfurry ears. So this basically came from a miscommunication with the vendor. When we showed Moss Man at Comic-Con, we did the flocked up version, which tested okay, and he had unflocked ears. When the vendor got a hold of him, they flocked the ears. And when we got back the PP sample, which is the production pilot, we said, oh, no, we're not supposed to have flocked ears. And, fans are not going to like this because they saw him at Comic-Con with unflocked ears. And yeah, you'd never want to show something and then have it be different because otherwise people will be coming for you with pitchforks and torches and that whole thing. Luckily, well, unluckily for me, it was a very stressful moment, and I probably just wanted to take the, sword to the belly right there. And we knew this was going to be a problem with public relations. But we figured out a way. We actually were able to divide the production up and do some of it with flocked ears and then change it for the subscribers without flocked ears and sell both of them as two different SKUs. It was a creative solution. It took a lot of logistic work, and it was a lot more work than, I think in the long run made money for Mattel doing that, but it was on me, and I did it. And I don't mind doing it because that's what you do when you're the brand manager of a collector line, is you find creative solutions like that. So Moss Man got split up into two different SKUs in Mattel's system, a flocked ear version and a non-flocked ear version, and that allowed us to fans knew what they were getting. In other words, it wasn't going to be a mystery whether you got the flocked ears and the non-flocked ears. You knew what you were ordering, you knew which one was in the subscription, and there was no mystery. All right, so flocked ears aside, we should probably talk about Moss Man's bio briefly and his creative plant-esque name. So Moss Man in the 2000X series was extremely powerful. He was kind of so powerful he could wipe out enemies with like an entire tidal wave of moss. And that really kind of inspired the idea that Moss Man was sort of a ancient Eternian god. Like, he had huge amounts of power. And because he also kind of looked like Bigfoot, sort of put in a bit about how he was a, sort of an urban legend. Did anyone see the Moss Man? I hear the Moss Man's out there. So that basically just came from, the fact that he looked like a green Bigfoot, and he actually wound up having huge amounts of powers. And that's where Moss Man there. And again, he's one of those characters that just really, percolates down into pop culture, and you see him get used a lot in MOTU merchandise because he's green, he's bright green, he's flocked, and I think this is personally my favorite piece of Moss Man merchandise ever, which was the Eternia Pine deodorant that we gave out at San Diego Comic-Con because, lots of people kind of need deodorant, and why not a fresh pine scent?